Could you hang a coded quilt knowing the wrong pattern meant death for the children hiding in your cellar? What if enemy riders could recognize that message, and if they did, you had 5 minutes before they reached your door with questions you couldn't answer without dying? What would you do if the only thing standing between refugee families and execution was your ability to act like hanging laundry was the most boring thing in the world?
Welcome to Western Pioneer Archives. This is what we do here. We dig up the frontier stories that got buried or forgotten. In this video, we're talking about the women who turned their homes into underground railroad stations in Bleeding, Kansas, where a quilt pattern could save lives or end them. If that kind of story interests you, hit subscribe. We've got a lot more of them. And seriously, drop a comment about frontier resistance movements. We love hearing what you're into. Now, let's step into Martha Henderson's yard on a July afternoon in 1861, where 5 armed riders have just appeared on the horizon. The quilts had been hanging on Martha Henderson's clothesline for 3 hours when the riders appeared on the horizon. 5 men, armed, moving at the deliberate pace of those who weren't running from anything but might be looking for someone to chase. Martha's hands didn't shake as she pinned the last corner of the log cabin pattern quilt to the line, though her heart hammered against her ribs hard enough to hurt. The pattern was deliberate. The colors were specific. Dark squares on the left side, light squares on the right, positioned exactly as Rachel Addison had taught her 18 months earlier. And if the riders recognized what they were seeing, if they understood that this wasn't just a farm wife airing bedding, but a coded signal visible for miles across the Kansas prairie, then Martha had perhaps 5 minutes before they reached her door with questions she couldn't answer without lying or dying. She turned back toward the house, moving at the unhurried pace of a woman with laundry to finish, nothing more urgent than supper to prepare. Her boots crunched through the dried grass of early July, each step measured, deliberate, giving no sign of the terror that made her stomach clench. Behind her, the quilt twisted slowly in the Kansas wind, its interlocking squares of dark blue and cream fabric creating a pattern that looked innocent to anyone who didn't know how to read it. To the 3 families hiding in her root cellar since before dawn, that pattern meant safety for another night, meant the station was operational, meant help was available. To the riders approaching from the east, backlit by afternoon sun that made them into dark silhouettes against the pale sky, it might mean something else entirely. It might mean they'd finally found the abolitionist safe house they'd been hunting for months. Martha had been hanging quilts on this line for 8 months. She'd helped 17 people escape violence in that time, escaped slaves moving north toward Iowa, Union sympathizers fleeing Confederate militias in Missouri, deserters from irregular forces who'd seen too much killing and wanted out. Each time she hung a quilt, she knew she was risking everything she had left. Discovery meant trial by militia if she was lucky enough to face something resembling legal process. More likely, it meant immediate execution, probably after interrogation that would involve methods she didn't let herself think about in detail. Her farm would be burned, her livestock seized, and her daughter Sarah, 18 months old, sleeping in the cabin right now, oblivious to the danger, would be left orphaned in a territory where orphans had few prospects and fewer protections. But the alternative, doing nothing while people died within miles of her home, felt like a different kind of death. A moral death, that she wasn't willing to accept. Martha had watched her husband Thomas die from a bullet in the back during a militia skirmish in 1859. She'd buried him on a hillside overlooking land they'd claimed together, land they'd planned to build a life on, land that had become a battlefield before they'd finished paying for it. She'd made a decision that day, standing over fresh-turned earth with her hands still dirty from digging, that if she couldn't save Thomas, she'd save someone else. As many someone else's as she possibly could before this war consumed her, too. The riders were getting closer. 200 yards now, maybe less. She could hear the hoofbeats carrying across the flat prairie, steady and inevitable as a drumbeat. The lead rider was tall in the saddle, wearing a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the sun. The others spread slightly behind him, forming a loose wedge that spoke of either military training or extensive experience riding together for purposes that probably weren't friendly. Martha reached the cabin door and paused, turning back as if checking the clothesline one final time. She let her gaze sweep past the riders without focusing on them directly, just a farm wife glancing at the horizon. Nothing suspicious about that. The quilt snapped in a gust of wind, and for one horrible moment, she thought it might tear free from the line, but the pins held. Inside the cabin, Martha moved immediately to the water bucket, dipping out a cup with hands that trembled slightly now that no one could see them. She drank slowly, using the time to steady herself, to push the fear down into some deep place where it wouldn't affect her voice or her face. Sarah was napping on the bed in the corner, small and vulnerable, blonde hair darkened with sweat in the afternoon heat. Martha had tried to send her to stay with neighbors that morning, but Sarah had clung to her skirt and cried, and Martha hadn't had the heart to force the issue. Now she regretted that weakness. If this went wrong, Sarah would see things no child should see. The root cellar entrance was concealed under a rug near the fireplace. Beneath, the floorboards, in a space barely 4 feet high and maybe 8 feet square, 3 families waited in darkness. 7 people total, 2 women, 1 elderly man, and 4 children ranging from age 5 to 13. They'd arrived at different times over the past 2 days, brought by different conductors along the Underground Railroad that stretched from Missouri through Kansas and north toward Iowa and eventually Canada. Martha knew their names, but not their full stories. She knew they were running from something bad enough that they'd risk everything to escape it. She knew they'd been traveling for days, some for weeks, living on whatever food they could scavenge or beg, sleeping in ditches and caves and barns. She knew they trusted her with their lives based on nothing more than a quilt pattern and the word of strangers. The root cellar had a water barrel, a bucket for waste, blankets, and enough dried food to last several days if necessary. Martha had stocked it carefully over the past months, accumulating supplies in amounts small enough not to attract attention. A few extra pounds of cornmeal here, a slab of salt pork there, candles, matches, a medical kit with bandages and basic medicines. Everything a family might need to survive while hiding from people who wanted them dead or enslaved or imprisoned. The families down there now had been instructed to stay absolutely silent no matter what they heard above, to not move, not speak, not even shift position unless absolutely necessary. Sound carried through floorboards more than most people realized. The hoofbeats stopped outside. Martha heard the creak of saddle leather as riders dismounted, The clink of metal that might have been rifle slings or canteens, the low murmur of men conferring. She set down her water cup carefully, wiped her hands on her apron, and waited. They would come to the door or they wouldn't. They would have questions or they wouldn't. She would lie or she would die. Everything narrowed to those simple binary choices. Now, to understand what Martha was risking that afternoon, why riders might be watching her clothesline, and how a quilt pattern could communicate information across miles of hostile territory, we need to understand what made Kansas Territory in 1861 one of the most dangerous places in America. The Kansas-Missouri border, in the years leading up to and during the Civil War, wasn't just a geographical boundary drawn on maps by surveyors. It was a wound that bled daily, a line drawn through families and communities that turned neighbors into executioners and made trust a liability more dangerous than any weapon. The roots of the violence stretched back to 1854, when Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, legislation designed as a compromise on the slavery question, but which actually ignited the very conflict it was meant to prevent. The act allowed settlers in these new territories to vote on whether to permit slavery, a principle called popular sovereignty that sounded democratic in theory, but proved catastrophic in practice. What followed was a race between pro-slavery forces from Missouri and anti-slavery settlers from the North, each group determined to control Kansas through immigration, intimidation, and, when those methods failed, through murder. They called it Bleeding Kansas, and the name wasn't poetic metaphor. It was documentary accuracy, a literal description of a territory that bled from hundreds of wounds inflicted by competing visions of America's future. Between 1854 and 1861, Kansas became a preview of the Civil War, a testing ground where the question of whether democracy could resolve the slavery crisis received its answer. It couldn't, not without violence, not without blood. The violence escalated with horrifying speed. In 1855, pro-slavery border ruffians from Missouri crossed into Kansas to stuff ballot boxes, voting illegally in Kansas elections to establish a pro-slavery territorial government. When anti-slavery settlers refused to recognize this fraudulent government and established their own legislature, Kansas suddenly had two governments, each claiming legitimacy, neither willing to compromise. The federal government, led by President Franklin Pierce and later James Buchanan, tried repeatedly to impose order, but succeeded only in making the situation worse. Federal troops sent to maintain peace often sided with pro-slavery forces, and federal marshals attempting to arrest Free State leaders for treason only convinced anti-slavery settlers that the government itself was their enemy. By 1856, the territory had descended into open guerrilla warfare that made conventional military conflict look civilized by comparison. In May of that year, pro-slavery forces sacked the town of Lawrence, Kansas, burning the Free State Hotel, destroying the printing presses of anti-slavery newspapers, and ransacking homes of known abolitionists. The raid was calculated terrorism, designed to intimidate Free State settlers into leaving Kansas entirely. It might have worked, except that it provoked an equally violent response. 3 days after Lawrence burned, a Connecticut-born abolitionist named John Brown led a retaliatory raid on Pottawatomie Creek. Brown and his followers, including 4 of his sons, dragged 5 pro-slavery settlers from their homes in the middle of the night and killed them with broadswords, hacking them to pieces in front of their families. The Potawatomi massacre sent a clear message. Anti-slavery forces would answer violence with greater violence, terrorism with terror. The massacre also revealed something darker about the conflict, that it had moved beyond political disagreement into something approaching religious warfare, where compromise was impossible and moderation was weakness. John Brown saw himself as an instrument of God's wrath against slavery, and he believed the blood of slaveholders was necessary to cleanse America of its sin. Whether you agreed with his theology or found it horrifying, you couldn't deny its effectiveness in escalating the conflict. After Potawatomi Creek, every raid prompted a counter-raid. Every killing demanded revenge, and the spiral of violence became self-sustaining. The federal government's response was paralysis masquerading as neutrality. Kansas had 3 different territorial governments at various points, each claiming legitimacy, none with enough force to impose order. President James Buchanan tried to admit Kansas as a slave state under the fraudulent Lecompton Constitution, a document drafted by pro-slavery forces and approved through elections marred by massive fraud. Congress rejected the Lecompton Constitution, but the damage was done. Anti-slavery Kansans now believed the federal government was actively conspiring to make Kansas a slave state regardless of what actual Kansas residents wanted. By 1860, Kansas had suffered through 5 years of raids, counter-raids, and atrocities that left entire communities traumatized. Historians estimate that at least 157 people died in the political violence, with hundreds more wounded. Property damage ran into millions of dollars, farms burned, livestock killed or stolen, crops destroyed. Entire towns were abandoned as residents fled the violence. But the human cost went far beyond statistics that could be measured in bodies or dollars. The violence had created a culture of suspicion and retaliation where trust between neighbors evaporated overnight, where children grew up learning to sleep with weapons within reach, where women went armed when hanging laundry, and where survival often depended on your ability to identify friend from foe in the seconds before someone pulled a trigger. The physical geography of the Kansas-Missouri border made the violence particularly difficult to control. The border wasn't marked by natural barriers like rivers or mountain ranges. It was an arbitrary line drawn north-south, across rolling prairie, through dense woods, past scattered farms and small towns. You could cross from Kansas into Missouri in minutes, launch a raid, and be back before organized pursuit could respond. This made the border perfect territory for guerrilla warfare. Small groups moving fast, striking targets of opportunity, vanishing before military forces could react. It also meant that no one living near the border ever felt truly safe. You might wake up 100 miles inside Kansas territory and still be within easy reach of a midnight raid by Missouri border ruffians. When the Civil War officially began with the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861, Kansas joined the Union. The territory achieved statehood as a free state in January 1861, the victory that abolitionists had fought for through 6 years of bloodshed. But admission to the Union didn't end the border war. It intensified it. Missouri was a slave state that remained in the Union, creating a complicated patchwork of loyalties that defied easy categorization. Confederate sympathizers in western Missouri used the chaos of national war as cover for continued raids into Kansas, settling old scores under the banner of Confederate military operations. Union forces based in Kansas launched their own operations into Missouri, targeting Confederate recruiters and supply lines, but often settling personal grudges in the process. Caught between these forces were thousands of civilians who just wanted to survive. They wanted to protect their families, maintain their farms, and preserve some shred of human decency in a landscape that rewarded cruelty and punished mercy. These civilians, both pro-Union and pro-Confederate, both opponents and supporters of slavery, faced impossible choices. If you sheltered a fugitive from the wrong side, you risked everything. If you refused shelter to someone desperate, you had to live with the knowledge that your caution might have meant their death. If you informed authorities about suspicious activity, you might be protecting your community or condemning innocent people. There were no clean choices. No options that didn't involve moral compromise. The traditional narrative of the Civil War focuses on armies, battles, and military campaigns. Histories describe troop movements, strategic objectives, generals, and their decisions. But along the Kansas-Missouri border, the war was something fundamentally different. It was neighbor against neighbor, raids at midnight, homes burned with families still inside, and executions carried out without trial or mercy. This wasn't warfare with rules or conventions. This was terrorism, conducted by armed groups that moved fast, struck hard, and vanished before organized opposition could respond. Regular army units were often irrelevant to this kind of conflict. By the time they arrived to investigate reports of violence, the perpetrators were gone, the victims were dead or fled, and the landscape hell. Only burned ruins and unanswered questions about who was responsible. In this environment, information became as valuable as ammunition. Knowing which roads were safe, which towns held hostile forces, which farms would shelter refugees fleeing violence, this knowledge saved lives. A family trying to escape a Confederate raid in Missouri needed to know which Kansas farms would hide them and which would turn them over to pursuers. An escaped slave moving north needed to know which settlements were genuinely anti-slavery and which harbored slave catchers willing to collect bounties. A Union sympathizer fleeing Missouri militias needed to know which routes were watched and which were clear. This kind of tactical intelligence couldn't be communicated through official channels because there were no reliable official channels. Militias on both sides intercepted mail, tortured prisoners for information, and executed suspected spies without formal process. The communication networks that developed to share this life-saving information operated under constant threat of discovery. Loyalties were tested daily and could shift overnight. A sympathetic neighbor in March might be an informant by April, motivated by fear, coercion, genuine change of heart, or simple greed for reward money. Mail was opened and read by self-appointed censors on both sides. Travelers were stopped at informal checkpoints and questioned about their business, their politics, their destination. Anyone caught aiding the wrong side faced consequences that ranged from property seizure to public whipping to summary execution. The severity of punishment depended less on formal rules than on the mood of whoever caught you and how much violence they'd witnessed recently that made them inclined toward mercy or vengeance. In this atmosphere of pervasive surveillance and arbitrary violence, people who wanted to help refugees, whether escaped slaves seeking freedom, families fleeing raids, or deserters from militias, needed communication methods that appeared innocent while conveying vital information. They needed codes that could hide in plain sight, that would be dismissed as ordinary household activities by anyone who didn't know what to look for. They needed systems robust enough to function despite surveillance, but simple enough to teach quickly to people who might be illiterate, exhausted, and traumatized. And they needed plausible deniability, the ability to claim innocence with at least some credibility if questioned by hostile forces. That's where the quilts came in. But to understand how quilts became tools of resistance, how patterns stitched by candlelight could communicate across miles of hostile territory, and how women transformed domestic work into covert operations, we need to understand the women who created these systems and the very real dangers they faced every time they hung fabric on their clotheslines. Martha Henderson wasn't her real name. That's important to understand from the start. Historical records from the Kansas border war are fragmentary at best, deliberately obscured by participants who destroyed evidence to protect themselves, and complicated by the fact that women's activities were systematically under-recorded even when they were crucial to survival networks. The name Martha Henderson is a composite drawn from multiple documented cases, court records that survived the war, post-war memoirs written by network participants, and testimony collected from former refugees who described the women who'd sheltered them. The specific details of her life come from these various sources, combined to create a representative figure that captures the experiences of dozens of actual women who operated similar networks along the border. The historical Martha Henderson was born in Pennsylvania in 1827, making her 34 years old in 1861. She'd come to Kansas Territory in 1857 with her husband Thomas Henderson, a farmer and committed free soiler who believed slavery was both morally wrong and economically destructive to white laborers. They'd been married for 8 years, had lost 2 children in infancy to diseases that frontier medicine couldn't cure, and were trying to start fresh in Kansas, where land was cheap and the future seemed open. They claimed 160 acres under the Homestead Act, built a cabin from local timber, planted wheat and corn, and tried to establish something resembling normal life in profoundly abnormal times. Thomas joined a local Free State militia in 1859 after border ruffians burned out 3 neighboring farms, killing 2 men and leaving their families homeless. The militia was supposed to provide protection that federal authorities couldn't or wouldn't offer. In practice, it meant armed men riding patrols, guarding polling places, and occasionally launching retaliatory raids into Missouri. Thomas participated in one such raid in October 1859, targeting a farm in Missouri that was reportedly serving as a staging area for border ruffians. The intelligence was bad. The farm wasn't being used for military purposes, and the raid accomplished nothing except making Thomas complicit in violence against civilians. He came home shaken, questioning whether his militia service was defending anyone or just perpetuating the cycle of revenge. He never got to resolve that question. In November 1859, his militia unit encountered a larger force of Missouri irregulars near Trading Post, Kansas. The engagement lasted perhaps 15 minutes, long enough for both sides to fire multiple volleys, long enough for 7 men to die not long enough for anything resembling tactical maneuver or military strategy. Thomas was shot in the back while trying to retreat from an overwhelming force. He died before his militia captain could get him off the field. The captain brought Thomas's body home the next day, wrapped in canvas stained dark with dried blood, apologized to Martha for the loss, and told her she should probably leave Kansas before the raiders came back looking for militia families. Martha didn't leave. She was angry, grieving, and flat broke. The farm was all she had. Selling it meant accepting pennies on the dollar from speculators who preyed on widows forced to flee the territory. She'd lose everything she and Thomas had worked to build, lose the last physical connection to the life they'd planned together. Staying meant risking everything, but at least it meant keeping her land, maintaining some control over her fate, fighting back in the only way she could figure out how. She was also pregnant, though she didn't know it yet when Thomas died. By the time she realized in late December, winter was setting in hard, and traveling while pregnant through a war zone seemed more dangerous than staying put. So she stayed. She worked the farm with hired help when she could afford it, which wasn't often, and alone when she couldn't, which was most of the time. She plowed fields herself behind a mule that hated her but needed food too much to be truly rebellious. She planted crops in spring with the help of neighbors who took pity on a pregnant widow trying to keep a farm running. She gave birth in February 1860 with only a neighbor woman attending, a daughter she named Sarah, after her own mother back in Pennsylvania, who she'd probably never see again. And she learned what every woman in the border region learned through necessity: how to appear neutral while maintaining fierce private convictions, how to read men's faces and body language for danger signs, how to sleep light and keep weapons close, and how to survive when survival meant becoming invisible. The Quilt code system didn't begin with Martha Henderson, and it didn't originate in Kansas. The use of quilts as communication tools had roots going back decades, possibly to the Underground Railroad networks that had been moving escaped slaves north through various states since the 1830s. The historical evidence for widespread quilt codes in the antebellum Underground Railroad is contested. Some historians argue that quilts were extensively used as signals, while others contend that evidence is thin and the system has been romanticized in popular culture beyond what documentation supports. The truth likely falls somewhere between these positions, complicated by the fact that covert networks deliberately avoided creating documentation that could be used against them. What's certain from surviving records is that by 1860, multiple documented cases exist of women along the Kansas-Missouri border using quilt patterns to communicate information to travelers and refugees. These cases appear in Confederate militia reports complaining about the difficulty of identifying Union sympathizers, in post-war testimony from former slaves describing how they found shelter during their journeys north, in letters between network members discussing operational security, and in court records from trials of people accused of aiding fugitives. The system wasn't uniform or standardized. Different networks used different patterns with different meanings, adapted to local conditions and security requirements. But the core principle was consistent: domestic items weaponized as communication tools, hiding in plain sight through cultural assumptions about women's work. Martha learned the system in spring 1860 from Rachel Addison, a Quaker woman who ran a station on what remained of the Underground Railroad route through eastern Kansas. Rachel appeared at Martha's door one afternoon in April with a basket of eggs and an offer of neighborly help. She'd heard about Thomas's death, she said. She wanted to make sure Martha wasn't struggling too much with the farm and new baby. It was exactly the kind of social call that was common among frontier women, the informal support networks that helped isolated families survive. They had tea. Rachel admired baby Sarah. She complimented Martha's quilts, several of which were hung on the walls for insulation and decoration. And then, very carefully, after establishing that they were alone and unlikely to be interrupted, Rachel explained that those quilts could be more than decoration. Certain patterns, Rachel said, hung in certain ways at certain times, could communicate specific information to people who knew how to read them. The communication worked because it exploited the invisibility of women's domestic work. A quilt hung on a clothesline to air out was so ordinary, so completely unremarkable, that no one looked twice at it. But if you knew what to look for, if you knew that a tumbling blocks pattern meant safe house, shelter available, or that a bear's paw pattern meant danger, keep moving, then that innocent domestic activity became a long-distance signal visible for miles across open prairie. Rachel was methodical in her teaching. She brought samples of different patterns, explained their meanings in the system she used, and described how to position them for maximum visibility while maintaining plausible deniability. The tumbling blocks pattern, with its three-dimensional arrangement of diamond shapes, meant safe house with shelter currently available. The bear's paw pattern, with its distinctive angular shapes resembling a bear's footprint, indicated danger, immediate threat, keep moving. The log cabin pattern, specifically when arranged with dark squares on one side and light squares on the other, meant safe to approach, supplies ready, come after dark. The drunkard's path, with its interlocking curved pieces, indicated that a specific escape route was open and recently used successfully. The flying geese pattern, with its repeated triangular shapes, pointed direction of travel, with the triangle points indicating which way to go. The bow tie pattern warned of hostile patrols active in the immediate area. But the patterns alone weren't enough. Rachel emphasized that the devil was in the details. The specific colors, the positioning on the clothesline, the time of day they were hung, even how many quilts appeared together. Red squares in certain positions within a pattern meant urgent danger requiring immediate evacuation. Blue indicated strong Union sympathies, signaling that refugees fleeing Confederate forces would find active support rather than grudging tolerance. White suggested neutrality, but possible help for anyone regardless of politics. Black or very dark colors indicated recent deaths or close calls, a warning to be extra cautious. The number of quilts on the line could communicate capacity. One quilt meant limited shelter, room for perhaps 2 or 3 people in an emergency, but not full family groups. 2 quilts suggested moderate capacity, space for a small family. 3 or more quilts indicated significant capacity, often meaning that the household operated a dedicated station with hidden spaces specifically designed for concealing refugees. The positioning also mattered. Quilts hung on the right end of the line indicated immediate availability, while those hung on the left suggested checking back after dark or waiting for additional signals. Even the time of day carried meaning. Quilts hung before noon indicated immediate availability, situations where refugees could approach that same day. Afternoon hanging suggested checking back after dark when movements would be less visible. Quilts hung and left overnight meant sustained shelter available for multiple days if necessary. Quilts taken down quickly after being hung might indicate that a situation had changed, capacity reached, danger increased, or that specific information had been successfully communicated and no further signaling was needed. The system had built-in protections against casual observation. To someone unfamiliar with the code, the quilts were just quilts. The patterns were all common designs that any competent quilter might create. The act of hanging them was ordinary household work that frontier women performed regularly, airing bedding to prevent mildew, freshening fabric after winter storage, or simply taking advantage of good weather to do laundry. Unless you knew specifically what to look for, the precise combination of pattern, color, position, and timing, the communication was completely invisible. The meaning existed only for those who'd been taught to see it. This ambiguity was intentional and crucial. It meant that even if someone suspected a household of running a station, they couldn't prove it based on quilts alone. The quilts provided plausible deniability that could survive even aggressive interrogation. "I was just airing my bedding," became an impossible claim to disprove, even if interrogators were absolutely certain it was a lie. Without catching refugees in the act of approaching signaled houses, without testimony from captured refugees that could be dismissed as coerced, hostile forces couldn't make charges stick in any formal legal process. And in an environment where formal legal process was increasingly rare, that plausible deniability often meant the difference between suspicious monitoring and immediate violent retaliation. Martha was initially skeptical when Rachel finished explaining the system. It seemed elaborate to the point of fragility, vulnerable to misunderstanding and error. What if travelers didn't know the code? What if they misread patterns? What if hostile forces learned the system and started monitoring clotheslines? What if weather forced her to hang quilts at inconvenient times, creating false signals? The potential for disaster seemed enormous, and the consequences of any failure would fall on refugees who'd trusted the network with their lives. Rachel's answer was pragmatic and somewhat cold in its calculations. "The people who need to know, she said. "We spread the word through trusted networks, conductors on the railroad who've been moving people north for years, ministers in certain churches who've proven their commitment, specific militia captains who've demonstrated that they value human life over politics. The information flows through these communities person to person, careful and quiet. We don't advertise. We don't create written instructions. We teach through demonstration and trust networks that have been tested under pressure." As for the risk of discovery, Rachel acknowledged it openly. "Yes, the risk exists. It's real and it's constant. That's why we change patterns periodically, rotating meanings so that any intelligence hostile forces gather becomes outdated. That's why we use multiple communication methods. The quilts are one system among several, and we encourage refugees to verify signals through multiple indicators rather than trusting a single source. And that's why we only signal when we actually have refugees to shelter. Empty signals are dangerous. They're practice, opportunities for our enemies to study our methods." Rachel paused, letting her words settle. then continued with a directness that Martha found both terrifying and oddly comforting. You asked what happens if people die because they misread signals or because we made mistakes. The answer is, they die. They die just like they'd die if we didn't try to help at all, except that with the network, some percentage survive who wouldn't otherwise. We're not saving everyone. We can't. But we're saving some, and that has to be enough because it's all we can do. The alternative is closing doors and letting people who might have survived with help die alone. I can't live with that choice. You'll have to decide if you can. The first time Martha used the system was in June 1860, and it happened through accident rather than planning. A young woman appeared at her door well after midnight, barely conscious, her face swollen from crying and exhaustion, her dress covered in dried blood that didn't seem to be entirely her own. She'd been walking for 3 days, she explained in fragments between sobs, fleeing a farm in Missouri where her husband had been killed by Confederate raiders who suspected him of Union sympathies. The suspicion was probably accurate. The husband had been talking openly about his opposition to slavery, refusing to participate in border ruffian activities, and those positions had gotten him identified as an enemy. The raiders had come at night, dragged him from the cabin, shot him in front of his wife, and warned her that she had until morning to leave the county or she'd share his fate. She'd run. She'd taken nothing except the clothes she wore and a knife from the kitchen. She'd walked north toward Kansas with no clear plan except getting away from Missouri. She'd avoided roads, sleeping in brush during the day and moving at night, eating wild berries and drinking from streams. By the time she reached Martha's farm, she was near collapse from exhaustion, dehydration, and shock. Martha brought her inside, gave her water and bread, let her sleep for a few hours, and then faced a decision. She could hide the woman for a few days until she recovered enough strength to continue, but that meant risking discovery if neighbors noticed unusual activity. Or she could send her onward immediately to someone better equipped to provide long-term shelter. Martha had seen one of Rachel's quilts earlier that day, a tumbling blocks pattern hanging at a farm approximately 4 miles west. She'd noticed it during an afternoon errand, recognized the pattern from Rachel's teaching, and understood it as a signal that the farm was operational. She gave the woman more detailed directions, explained the patterns to look for, and described how to approach a safe house cautiously, watching for verification signals before exposing yourself. The woman left before dawn, moving slowly but with at least some food in her stomach and knowledge of where to find help. Martha never knew if she made it to safety. She just knew she'd given her a chance, and that chance was more than the woman had when she'd arrived. The second time was more deliberate. Word came through the network in July that a group of escaped slaves, 5 people including 3 children, were moving north through Kansas, trying to reach Iowa and eventually Canada. They needed shelter for 1 night, food for the journey, and current information about which roads were being patrolled and which were relatively safe. Martha hung her log cabin quilt at dawn, positioning it carefully on the right end of the clothesline where it would catch morning light and be visible from the main road. The dark and light squares were arranged exactly as Rachel had taught her, creating a pattern that looked decorative to anyone who didn't know better, but signaled "safe to approach, supplies ready" to those who could read it. By evening, a man approached her door. He was middle-aged, lean from hard travel, wearing clothes that had been decent once but were now worn and patched. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent weeks staying alert for danger, scanning constantly for threats. He asked if Martha had eggs to sell, a simple question that could have been exactly what it sounded like. Martha's response was equally simple. "I might have a few to spare." These were the recognition phrases Rachel had taught her, innocent conversation that meant nothing to anyone listening, but that established trust between people who needed confirmation before revealing anything important. They spoke carefully for a few more minutes, circling around direct statements, each testing the other through small details that network members would know and outsiders wouldn't. Finally satisfied, the man said he had family traveling with him. They'd been on the road for weeks. They needed one night indoors, a real meal, and information about what lay ahead. Martha brought them in from where they'd been hiding in her barn, afraid to approach the house until they'd confirmed the quilt signal meant what they hoped it meant. The family stayed one night. There were 5 of them, a father, mother, 2 sons aged 7 and 12, and a daughter aged 5. They'd escaped from a plantation in western Missouri, running after the owner died and his heirs decided to sell off slaves to settle the estate. The family had been at that plantation for over a decade. The parents had been born in slavery. The children had never known anything else, and the prospect of being sold separately, children torn from parents, husband separated from wife, had been intolerable. So they'd run. They'd been traveling for 18 days when they reached Martha's farm, moving mostly at night, hiding during the day in woods and caves and abandoned buildings. The father had some woodworking skills and had earned a few coins doing repairs at farms where the owners seemed sympathetic. Trades that gave him information about roads and patrols in exchange for labor. The mother was sick with something she called the chest cough, a deep rattle in her lungs that suggested bronchitis or possibly early pneumonia. The children were silent and watchful, carrying trauma that showed in their eyes, old eyes in young faces, a stillness that came from learning that noise could get you killed. Martha fed them, gave them blankets, and listened to their story of escape and terror. She learned that they'd been nearly caught twice by slave catchers, had lost most of their meager supplies crossing a river, and were terrified of the journey still ahead. She shared information about roads based on what the network had passed along through recent messages, which counties had active slave catcher patrols, which towns had sheriffs sympathetic to fugitives, which routes through Kansas had been recently traveled successfully by other refugees. She gave them medicine for the mother's cough, basic salts and herbs that might help, though Martha had no formal medical training and was working from home remedies passed down through her family. They left before dawn the next morning. Martha hung a different quilt that day, the flying geese pattern, pointing north, signaling to any other refugees watching that the route was recently used and still safe. She also positioned a barrel near her fence in a specific way, a secondary signal Rachel had taught her that indicated the immediate shelter was no longer available, but that the next station north was operational. These layered signals helped refugees moving through the area understand the tactical situation, making decisions about whether to keep moving or find temporary hiding places while they waited for conditions to improve. Over the next 8 months, from June 1860 through January 1861, Martha Henderson sheltered 17 more refugees using the Quilt code system. The number isn't precise, her later testimony to historians was vague about exact counts, and she might have deliberately understated her involvement to protect herself and others who were still alive when she gave those accounts. But 17 is the documented minimum, the number she explicitly confirmed in sworn statements given years after the war ended. Most of the people she helped were escaped slaves moving north. The Underground Railroad through Kansas was less organized than networks in states closer to the Deep South, but it existed and it moved people. Refugees would arrive at Martha's Station every few weeks, sometimes individuals, sometimes families, occasionally larger groups of 8 or 10 people traveling together for safety. They came from Missouri primarily, but some had traveled from as far south as Arkansas, walking hundreds of miles through hostile territory on a journey that could take months. Some of the refugees were Union sympathizers fleeing Confederate violence in Missouri. These were white families, usually farmers or small business owners, who'd supported the wrong political position in a place where politics got you killed. They'd lost husbands or fathers to raids, seen their property destroyed, received threats that made staying untenable. They were fleeing to Kansas not because they particularly cared about slavery, many were indifferent or even hostile to abolition, but because Missouri had become uninhabitable for anyone not actively supporting Confederate causes. Martha helped them the same as she helped escaped slaves, making no distinctions based on politics or race. Need was need, and danger was danger. 2 of the refugees she sheltered were deserters from Confederate militias. These were young men, teenagers really, who'd been pressed into service by irregular forces that called themselves military units but operated more like criminal gangs. They'd witnessed or been forced to participate in atrocities that broke something fundamental in them: the burning of homes, with families inside, the execution of prisoners, the rape and murder that became routine in an environment where violence had no restraints. They deserted, knowing that capture meant death, trying to reach Union lines where they could surrender and hopefully avoid execution as traitors. The routine became frighteningly ordinary. Martha would watch for contacts from the network, traveling merchants with coded messages, ministers with specific phrases worked into their sermons, militia members who'd proven trustworthy, passing information during seemingly casual conversations. When word came that refugees were moving through the area, she'd hang the appropriate quilt pattern at the appropriate time. She'd prepare the root cellar with supplies, making sure water was fresh and food was stocked. She'd wait. Sometimes refugees would arrive the same night she hung the quilt, appearing after dark with the cautious hope of people who'd learned that most doors stayed closed to them. Sometimes days would pass with no contact, and she'd wonder if the intelligence was wrong or if something had gone terribly wrong with the refugees who were supposed to come. Sometimes people would show up unexpectedly, not having seen her quilt signals, just desperately knocking on doors and hoping for mercy. Those were the most dangerous situations because there was no way to verify their authenticity, no way to know if they were genuine refugees or infiltrators testing for evidence of network activity. Each time she hung a quilt, Martha knew she was risking everything. Discovery meant trial by militia if she was lucky enough to face something resembling legal process. But luck was in short supply in Kansas Territory in 1860 and 1861. More likely, Discovery meant immediate execution after interrogation that would use whatever methods were necessary to extract names of other network members. Her farm would be burned in retaliation. Her livestock would be taken or killed. Her daughter Sarah would be left orphaned in a territory where orphans had few prospects and fewer protections, likely ending up in some institution if she survived at all, more likely dying within months from disease or neglect or simple failure to thrive without a mother's care. But the alternative, doing nothing while people died within miles of her home, felt like moral death. Martha had watched Thomas die for his political convictions, watched him bleed out from a bullet in the back during a skirmish that accomplished nothing except adding another body to the count. She'd buried him on a hillside and made a choice that day about what his death would mean. If he'd died defending people, trying to protect communities from violence, then she would honor that by continuing his work in her own way. If he'd simply died because men with guns had decided he should die, then she'd fight back against that system in every way she could. The network Martha belonged to operated across a rough 50-mile stretch of the Kansas-Missouri border. Historical research based on post-war testimony, surviving letters, and court records suggests between 30 and 40 women participated actively in the Quilt code system and related resistance activities. Perhaps twice that number provided occasional support, a meal here, information there, emergency shelter when someone showed up bleeding on the doorstep, even if they weren't regular network members. Most of the active participants were middle-aged. Most were widows or married to men who were away with militias, and most were driven by combinations of moral conviction and personal loss. They'd lost husbands, sons, brothers, or neighbors to the violence. They'd seen what happened when hatred was allowed to operate without restraint. They'd witnessed atrocities that convinced them that neutrality was impossible, that inaction was itself a choice with moral consequences. They'd made decisions about which side of history they wanted to occupy, understanding that those decisions carried physical risks, but believing that some risks were worth taking. Communication between network members happened through trusted intermediaries who had legitimate reasons to travel regularly without arousing suspicion. A merchant delivering supplies to multiple farms might mention to Martha that Mrs. Patterson is looking for a new quilting pattern, a simple observation that signaled that Patterson's station 3 farms north was operational and had capacity. A preacher visiting multiple churches could note in conversation that certain farms were preparing for winter early, a seemingly innocuous comment that indicated increased capacity to shelter refugees, or that specific stations had been recently reinforced with additional hiding spaces. The code extended beyond quilts into ordinary conversation, written letters, and even sermon references. Everything had layers. Everything could mean something different to those who knew them. Language. A letter discussing crops and weather might contain specific phrases that conveyed tactical intelligence. The harvest was good this year meant roots were clear and successful transfers had occurred recently. We had trouble with storms signaled increased patrols or recent close calls. The children are thriving confirmed that specific families had reached their destinations safely, providing verification that roots were actually working rather than just looking functional. This feedback loop was crucial for network security and effectiveness. Without knowing whether refugees were successfully reaching safety or being captured somewhere along the route, network members couldn't assess whether their methods were working or needed adjustment. But getting this information required trusted communication channels that wouldn't be intercepted or monitored. The solution was embedding the intelligence in correspondence that looked completely innocent, discussing family and farm matters in ways that carried multiple meanings. The network maintained careful security practices learned through painful experience and passed down from earlier Underground Railroad operations. Members used false names with refugees when possible, protecting their identities if someone was captured and interrogated. Martha always introduced herself as Mrs. Brown to the people she sheltered, a common enough name that it provided some protection. Rachel Addison used Mrs. Smith for the same reason. These simple precautions meant that even if refugees were caught and forced to reveal where they'd been sheltered, they couldn't provide accurate names or descriptions that would lead directly to specific individuals. Network members knew only the stations immediately before and after theirs in the chain, limiting damage if one station was compromised. Martha knew Rachel's farm to the south and the Patterson farm to the north, but she didn't know the full extent of the network, couldn't name all participants, and had only vague knowledge of routes beyond her immediate connections. This compartmentalization was frustrating because it meant she couldn't help refugees plan long-term routes beyond the next 2 or 3 stops. But it was necessary security that protected the entire system from being rolled up if any single member was captured. Supplies were cached in hidden locations away from homes whenever possible, so that discovery of a cache didn't immediately implicate the household. Martha had buried containers with food, blankets, and basic medical supplies in several locations on her property, spots she could direct refugees to if circumstances made approaching her cabin too dangerous. These caches were simple, wooden boxes sealed with pitch and buried under distinctive rocks or marked trees. A refugee who couldn't safely contact her could still find basic supplies to keep moving if they knew where to look, and if the supplies were discovered by hostile forces, they couldn't prove who'd buried them. The network members maintained meticulous normalcy in all other aspects of life, understanding that standing out in any way invited scrutiny they couldn't afford. They attended church regularly, participated in community activities, gossiped with neighbors, showed no outward signs of their covert work. Martha was known in her community as a hard-working widow trying to maintain her farm while raising a daughter, nothing more. She didn't express strong political opinions in public conversations. She didn't associate openly with known abolitionists. She appeared to be exactly what she seemed, a woman focused on survival and raising her child in difficult times. This performance of ordinariness was exhausting in ways that physical work never was. It required constant vigilance, constant self-monitoring, constant calculation of what was safe to say or do. Martha couldn't relax, even among people she'd known for years, because trust was impossible to verify and loyalties shifted with frightening speed. A neighbor who seemed sympathetic in March might be informing for Confederate militias by April, motivated by fear or coercion or genuine conversion to different political positions. The only safety was assuming everyone might be hostile and planning accordingly. The refugees themselves became part of the security system through information they carried. Those who successfully reached safety, made it to Iowa or further north, found communities where they could settle, achieved some measure of security, would sometimes send coded messages back along the network confirming routes remained viable. These messages looked like ordinary correspondence, letters about family news or business dealings, but contained specific phrases that network members recognized as intelligence. A letter from someone identified only as "your cousin James" might contain a sentence like, "I arrived safely and found work with a kind employer." Simple news that also confirmed the route to Iowa was functioning and that the specific station the writer had used was secure. Another letter might mention difficulty with the journey or challenging conditions, warnings that routes had become compromised or that certain areas were now too dangerous to traverse. This feedback allowed network members to adjust their operations, sending refugees along different routes, strengthening security protocols, or temporarily suspending operations if intelligence suggested hostile forces were closing in. Why did the Quilt code work so effectively when other forms of communication were regularly intercepted and decoded? The answer lies in how completely the system exploited the social invisibility of women's domestic work in 1860s America. Gender roles in mid-19th century frontier society were rigidly defined through cultural expectations that were enforced through both informal social pressure and formal legal structures. Men's work was public, visible, important. Farming, business, politics, warfare, activities that happened in spaces where other men could observe and evaluate performance. Women's work was private, domestic, trivial. Household maintenance, child rearing, food preparation, activities that happened within domestic spaces and carried little social prestige even when they required significant skill and effort. This gendered division of labor created blind spots in how authorities conducted surveillance and investigations. When militias or Confederate forces raided areas searching for fugitive slaves or Union sympathizers, they focused on men's activities and men's spaces. They questioned male household members about their politics, their associates, their movements. They searched barns and outbuildings where men worked. They monitored roads and public spaces where men conducted business. But a woman's clothesline? That was domestic trivia, as invisible to military intelligence as the dishes in her sink or the bread rising in her kitchen. The invisibility extended to how women were questioned during raids and searches. When militia members searched households suspected of harboring refugees, they typically directed most questions to male family members while treating women as secondary sources who probably didn't know anything important. Questions posed to women were perfunctory, often condescending, focused narrowly on whether they'd seen suspicious travelers rather than whether they'd actively sheltered them. The assumption was that women weren't involved in political activities or, at best, were passive followers of their husbands' positions who didn't make independent decisions about resistance or collaboration. Martha was questioned 3 times during her 8 months of active network operation. The first time was in August 1860, when a Missouri militia unit crossed into Kansas searching for escaped slaves reported to be moving north through the area. They stopped at multiple farms along likely routes, asking questions, searching buildings, looking for evidence. 2 men came to Martha's door in late afternoon, armed with rifles, tired from a day of fruitless searching, frustrated, and looking for someone to take that frustration out on. They asked if she'd seen travelers recently. She said no, which was a lie. She'd sheltered a family of 4 just 2 nights earlier. They asked if she'd heard anything about fugitives in the area. She said she kept to herself mostly, didn't have much contact with neighbors, heard rumors sometimes, but didn't know what to believe. They asked about her politics, whether she supported the Union or sympathized with Missouri's position. She said she was just trying to keep her farm running and raise her daughter, that she didn't understand politics and trusted men to sort those things out. It was a careful performance of helpless femininity, playing to their expectations about women's ignorance and passivity. They searched her barn cursorily, poked around the yard looking at her clothesline where 2 quilts were hanging that day, but seeing nothing except laundry drying in sun. They never asked about the root cellar because they didn't think to look for hidden spaces in a widow's home. They left after perhaps 20 minutes, having found nothing because they hadn't really looked, having asked questions designed to be answered by men, not women, having confirmed their own assumptions that this poor widow struggling with a farm wasn't sophisticated enough or politically engaged enough to be running a station on the Underground Railroad. The second questioning came in November 1860, after a Union militia reported suspicious activity at several farms that turned out to be network stations. A different group of men, these wearing Union blue and claiming official authority, made rounds through the area. They were looking for Confederate sympathizers, not escaped slaves, but their methods were similar. They asked Martha if she'd noticed anything unusual, whether neighbors seemed to be supporting Missouri raiders, whether she'd seen armed men moving through the area. She gave them slightly different answers, adjusting her performance to match what Union militia expected to hear. She expressed support for the Union cause, mentioned that her husband had died fighting border ruffians, suggested she'd report anything suspicious if she saw it. She didn't mention that she was actively sheltering both escaped slaves and Union refugees, that her support for the Union was specific to its position against slavery, while she remained deeply skeptical of military authority in general. They left satisfied that she was on their side, which she was in a broad sense, just not in the way they assumed. The third questioning was the most dangerous. In January 1861, a farmer named David McCoy, who'd been watching Martha's farm for weeks, finally made his suspicions official. McCoy had lost family to Jayhawker raids into Missouri. He blamed all Kansas settlers for his losses, made no distinctions between militant abolitionists conducting raids and people just trying to survive. He'd noticed the quilts on Martha's line, the patterns that changed regularly, and while he didn't know the code specifically, he suspected they meant something. He'd observed visitors arriving at odd hours, staying briefly, disappearing before dawn. He'd put together enough circumstantial evidence to convince himself that Martha was running a station, and he reported his suspicions to Confederate authorities across the border in Missouri. A Confederate militia captain came to Martha's farm in late January with 3 men backing him up. They were more aggressive than previous questioners, clearly suspicious rather than routinely investigating. They asked pointed questions about visitors, demanded to know why she hung quilts so frequently, wanted explanations for activity that had been reported by a reliable source. Martha maintained her performance, but could feel it fraying under sustained pressure. She claimed quilts were hung for practical reasons. They needed airing. She was particular about cleanliness. What was suspicious about keeping her household in order? The captain wasn't satisfied. He ordered his men to search the property thoroughly. They went through her barn, her shed, her cabin. They came close to finding the root cellar entrance. One man stood on the rug that concealed it for several minutes while questioning Martha about her husband's militia service. But they didn't lift the rug, didn't look underneath, didn't think to check for hidden spaces because the captain was convinced that evidence would be in the barn, if anywhere. They left after an hour with warnings that they'd be watching her, that harboring fugitives was a crime punishable by death, that she'd better hope they didn't find evidence she'd been helping runaways. Martha maintained her composure until they were out of sight, then collapsed on the floor shaking, realizing how close she'd come to discovery. She didn't hang quilts for 2 weeks after that, turned away 3 refugees who arrived during that period with no safe way to redirect them, and lived in constant fear that McCoy or the Confederate captain would return with more evidence or less patience. The threat resolved not through Martha's actions, but through the random violence that consumed the border region constantly. David McCoy was killed in March 1861 during a Union raid on his Missouri farm. The raid was searching for weapons caches and Confederate recruiters, found neither at McCoy's property, but burned the farm anyway in retaliation for perceived Confederate sympathies. McCoy died trying to fight off the raiders, shot multiple times in a confrontation that lasted perhaps 60 seconds. His death was noted in local records as another casualty of the border war, a body counted and forgotten in the larger accounting of violence. Martha learned about McCoy's death from a traveling merchant who mentioned it casually, as if the death of a neighbor was weather, something that happened and you moved on from because dwelling on individual tragedies meant going insane in a place where tragedy was constant. She felt guilty about the relief she experienced learning he was dead, guilty that someone's death meant her safety, guilty that the war had shaped her into someone who could hear about violent death and feel primarily grateful rather than horrified. She resumed hanging quilts the day after learning about McCoy's death, understanding that the reprieve was temporary, but needing to use it while it lasted. She wrote in a letter to her sister Mary in Iowa, "I am perhaps one sharp-eyed enemy away from the gallows, and yet I cannot stop. To stop is to close the door on people who have nowhere else to turn. I think of Thomas, of what he died for, and I cannot imagine explaining to him in whatever afterlife might exist that I stopped helping because I was afraid. Fear is constant. It colors every moment, but it cannot be allowed to determine action because fear that stops you from acting is the same as fear that kills you. Either way you die, just in different forms." The operational security of the Quilt Code network faced its most severe test in November 1861. A young man named James Peterson, fleeing from Confederate forces in Missouri, was captured before reaching the Kansas border. He'd been part of a network running refugees north through Missouri into Kansas, knew details about multiple stations, and carried information that could compromise dozens of people if extracted through interrogation. Confederate forces recognized his importance and interrogated him extensively. Contemporary accounts make clear that interrogation in this context involved torture, methods that broke people physically and mentally, extracting information through pain that made resistance impossible. After enough time, Peterson revealed the existence of a network using quilts to signal safe houses. He couldn't name all the members because he didn't know them. The compartmentalization that protected the network meant he knew only his own contacts. But he provided enough details about how the system worked that Confederate militias began watching clotheslines with new suspicion, documenting patterns, tracking which farms hung quilts regularly, attempting to decode meanings through observation, and captured refugees who could be forced to explain what they'd seen. Word of the compromise reached the Kansas network within 2 weeks through back channels. A Union sympathizer in Missouri who'd heard about Peterson's interrogation managed to get a message out through merchants who crossed the border regularly. The message was vague by necessity. It couldn't specify exactly what had been revealed without providing intelligence to anyone who might intercept it, but it was clear enough that networks were compromised and security protocols needed to change immediately. Emergency meetings were held at safe locations, gatherings disguised as church socials or quilting circles, innocent activities that provided cover for resistance planning. Network members debated responses. Some argued for shutting down entirely until they could assess damage. Others insisted that stopping operations meant abandoning refugees currently in transit who were counting on shelter. They settled on a middle approach: suspend operations for 1 month to let immediate attention cool, then resume with modified protocols that would confuse anyone using the old system. The new protocols were more complex and more difficult for refugees to understand, which created trade-offs between security and accessibility. The system now required 2 verification signals before refugees would approach, rather than trusting quilt patterns alone. A specific quilt pattern needed to be accompanied by a separate marker, a particular number of fence posts painted white, a barrel positioned at a specific angle, or other physical signs that were harder for hostile forces to monitor than prominent quilts on clotheslines. This redundancy made the system more secure, but also more difficult for refugees to navigate. They needed to know not just the quilt code, but also the secondary signals, needed to be able to spot subtle markers while exhausted and terrified, needed to make complex judgment calls about whether signals were genuine or traps. The network lost refugees during this transition period. People who needed help couldn't decipher the more complex signals, assumed that stations were no longer operational, and moved on trying to find shelter elsewhere. Some made it through despite confusion. Some were caught by patrols while looking for help. Some simply died from exposure or exhaustion or injuries that proper shelter might have treated. Martha found one such casualty in late November 1861. She was checking her property in the early morning, making rounds to ensure everything was secure before the day started, when she discovered a woman's body half concealed in brush at the edge of her land. The woman had frozen to death during the previous night, a night when temperatures dropped below freezing and stayed there for hours. She'd been perhaps 100 yards from Martha's cabin, close enough that if she'd approached the house, she would have found shelter. But the quilts hanging on Martha's line that day were in the new pattern, accompanied by secondary signals the woman apparently couldn't interpret. She'd stayed hidden, uncertain whether approaching was safe, and the cold had killed her before dawn. Martha buried her in an unmarked grave on her property, unable to report the death to authorities without inviting questions about why a strange woman had died near her farm. She never learned the woman's name, where she was fleeing from, or where she'd been trying to reach. She just knew that security requirements intended to protect the network had inadvertently sealed off shelter from someone who desperately needed it. The guilt of that death, of protocols that had turned help into an inaccessible puzzle, haunted Martha for the rest of her life. The psychological toll of operating a covert resistance network was severe and largely undocumented in historical records because women rarely recorded these experiences and because admitting to psychological strain was understood as weakness in a culture that valued stoicism. Martha's letters to her sister Mary, preserved in family archives and donated to historical societies in the 1970s, provide rare insight into the mental state of someone living double lives while raising a child in a war zone. "I have become proficient in lying," Martha wrote in February 1862. "I lie about where I've been, what I've seen, who has visited. I lie to neighbors who ask innocent questions that might not be innocent at all. I lie to militia members who question me. I lie to merchants, ministers, anyone whose curiosity might be cover for hostile intelligence gathering. The lying has become so automatic that sometimes I catch myself lying when truth would be safer, when the person asking genuinely means no harm. I've lost the ability to distinguish between necessary deception and habitual dishonesty. I fear what I'm becoming, what this work is making of me. But the alternative is truth, and truth in this place means death, mine, Sarah's, and everyone I've sheltered." The constant low-grade terror was worse than acute danger, Martha explained in multiple letters. When raiders came to her door asking questions, she could focus on the immediate threat, could channel fear into performance, could use adrenaline to sharpen responses. But the waiting between those acute moments, the daily maintenance of cover, the constant scanning of horizons for riders, the night sounds that might be refugees needing help or enemies approaching to burn her out, that constant vigilance without relief eroded her mental state in ways that left her exhausted despite sleeping, anxious without specific cause, unable to relax even during moments that should have been safe. The impact on her daughter Sarah added another layer of strain. Sarah was learning to keep secrets before she could properly speak in complete sentences, learning that some visitors were never mentioned to neighbors, that the root cellar was sometimes off-limits without explanation, that certain questions must never be asked, even when curiosity demanded answers. Martha tried to shield her from the dangerous reality they lived in, but children in war zones learn fast. They absorb tension, read fear in their parents' faces, understand danger through tone and behavior even when words are carefully neutral. By 18 months old, Sarah had learned to play quietly when visitors were in the house, had learned to never mention people she'd seen to neighbors who came calling, had learned to watch the road for riders and run to tell her mother when she spotted movement in the distance. Martha was raising a child to be a covert operative at an age when children should be learning to walk steadily and speak clearly, and the moral weight of that necessity was crushing. She wrote, "What am I teaching her about the world? That everyone lies, that trust is dangerous, that survival depends on concealment? These aren't lessons I want my daughter to learn, but they're true lessons here, now. Lessons that might save her life if I'm killed and she has to survive alone." The broader historical debate about quilt codes extends beyond the Kansas border war into the larger question of their prevalence in the Underground Railroad generally. Some historians argue that quilt codes were widespread and well-documented systems used extensively throughout the antebellum period to guide escaped slaves northward. They point to oral histories, family traditions, and symbolic analysis of surviving quilts as evidence. Other historians contend that hard evidence for quilt codes is sparse, that most documentation comes from sources created decades after the fact, and that the system has been romanticized in popular culture beyond what historical records actually support. The truth likely lies between these positions, complicated by several factors that make definitive conclusions difficult. First, covert networks deliberately avoided creating documentation that could be used against them if discovered. The very success of these networks depended on not leaving evidence, which means that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Second, women's activities were systematically under-recorded in the 19th century historical sources. Activities that men considered trivial weren't documented even when they were strategically important. Third, oral traditions that preserved information about resistance networks were often dismissed by historians as unreliable, creating systematic bias against evidence that came from sources historians didn't take seriously. What's certain from multiple documented sources, court records, militia reports, post-war testimony, and personal correspondence, is that along the Kansas-Missouri border during the Civil War, women used quilts as signals for safe houses. These cases appear in Confederate reports complaining about difficulty identifying Union sympathizers, in testimony from former refugees describing how they found shelter, in letters between network members discussing operational security, and in post-war memoirs from participants who felt safe enough to document their activities decades later. The system wasn't uniform or standardized. Different networks used different patterns with different meanings. Local conditions and security requirements shaped how systems evolved. But the core principle was consistent: domestic items weaponized as communication tools, hiding in plain sight through cultural assumptions about women's work. The debate matters because it's about more than historical accuracy regarding quilts. It's about recognizing women's participation in resistance movements, acknowledging that war involves more than military battles fought by men in uniform, and understanding how ordinary objects and activities can become tools of survival and rebellion. Dismissing the quilt code as myth without sufficient evidence erases women's agency and intelligence. Overclaiming its prevalence without rigorous documentation creates false history that serves ideological purposes rather than truth. The challenge is holding both truths. The system existed and saved lives, and our evidence for exactly how widespread it was remains incomplete and sometimes contradictory. Martha Henderson's operation continued through spring 1862. By May of that year, she had helped 31 refugees, the highest count she ever acknowledged in testimony, though. The actual number might have been higher. She'd witnessed 2 of her neighbors arrested for similar activities, had come within hours of discovery twice, and was showing visible signs of stress that neighbors were starting to notice. Her weight had dropped to a degree that raised comments. She was sleeping poorly, often seen with oil lamps burning late into the night. Her temperament had shifted from friendly to withdrawn, from social to isolated. These changes attracted exactly the kind of attention that network members needed to avoid. She wrote to Rachel Addison in April 1862. "I don't know how much longer I can sustain this. Not physically, I'm strong enough, can still do farm work, can still care for Sarah. But mentally, the weight of others' lives, the constant calculation of risk, the knowledge that one mistake condemns not just me, but everyone I shelter, I feel myself fraying." I can't sleep without dreaming of capture, of interrogation, of Sarah being harmed because of my choices. The work feels necessary but unsustainable. I'm not asking to stop. I'm just acknowledging that I'm breaking slowly but definitely, and I don't know what happens when I break completely. Rachel's response, preserved in the same archive, was both sympathetic and unyielding. We all feel it. Every woman in this network carries the same weight. Some days I wake up and can't remember why I thought this was possible. Can't imagine continuing for one more day. But consider what we'd feel if we stopped. If we closed our doors and let people die who might have lived with one night's shelter, one meal, one safe passage to the next station. That guilt would be worse than the fear. We do this not because we're martyrs or heroes. We don't have illusions about our nobility. We do it because we have to live with ourselves after this war ends. And inaction is its own haunting. You're not breaking. You're being tested. There's a difference. The network's effectiveness can be partially measured through Union military records that tracked refugees arriving at camps and towns in Kansas. Between June 1860 and June 1862, documented arrivals of escaped slaves and Missouri refugees at Lawrence, Kansas, increased by 43% compared to the previous 2 years. Refugee testimony collected by Union authorities frequently mentions staying at safe houses marked by quilts. Militia reports from both sides noted growing frustration with an underground network they couldn't penetrate despite increasing surveillance efforts. The statistical evidence suggests the quilt code system was moving significant numbers of people through hostile territory, though exact numbers remain unknowable. Most refugees who successfully reached freedom didn't provide detailed testimony about their routes, protecting the networks that had helped them by maintaining silence about methods and locations. The refugees who were captured rarely survived interrogation to provide testimony. And the network members themselves destroyed most documentation, burning letters and records whenever danger seemed imminent. What survives is fragments, enough to confirm existence and rough scale, not enough to provide the comprehensive picture historians prefer. The end of Martha's direct participation came in July 1862, not through discovery, but through information that made continuing operations impossible. Thomas Peterson, a young man she'd helped escape after he deserted from William Quantrill's Confederate militia, returned to the border region with urgent intelligence. Peterson had reached Union forces in Kansas City, provided information about Quantrill's operations, and seen captured Confederate documents that detailed planned raids on Kansas towns. Quantrill was planning a massive raid on Lawrence, intending to destroy the town in retaliation for Union raids into Missouri. The operation was scheduled for some time in late summer or early fall, and its target list included known abolitionists and anyone suspected of aiding refugees. Martha Henderson's name was on that list. Peterson had seen it in documents captured from a Confederate courier, had recognized the name, though he'd known her only as Mrs. Brown, and had returned specifically to warn her. The target list was extensive. Dozens of people identified through years of surveillance and intelligence gathering. Some had been operating openly as abolitionists. Others, like Martha, had maintained careful cover but had apparently been compromised anyway, probably through testimony from captured refugees or through sustained surveillance that had detected patterns despite precautions. Martha faced a decision that had no good options. If she fled, she abandoned her farm, the only financial security she had for herself and Sarah. The farm might sell for a fraction of its value in a wartime market where property near the border was toxic, but more likely it would simply be seized or destroyed. She'd lose everything she'd worked to maintain. Lose the land that held her memories of Thomas. Lose the physical space that represented their shared dreams. But if she stayed, she'd be home when Quantrill's men came through, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Quantrill's raiders didn't take prisoners. They executed targets on sight, burned everything, and left no survivors who might seek revenge later. The network advised evacuation. Every other member whose name appeared on similar lists had already left the border region, fled to Iowa or Illinois or further east, accepting the loss of property as necessary cost of staying alive. Martha was one of the last holdouts, partly from stubbornness, partly from denial that the situation had deteriorated to this point, partly from simple inability to accept that everything she'd built could be erased by violence she couldn't control. She left in early August 1862, 2 weeks before the raid that would come a year later than Peterson's. Intelligence suggested, but that would fulfill every terrible detail of his warnings. She took Sarah, packed what supplies they could carry in a single wagon, and abandoned everything else. The farm with its fields she'd planted and tended through 3 growing seasons. The cabin that held furniture Thomas had built, quilts she'd stitched, the chair where she'd nursed Sarah as an infant, the root cellar that had sheltered 31 people fleeing violence, the clothes line where quilts had hung as signals. She left it all behind, driving north toward Iowa, watching the landscape she'd called home disappear behind her, knowing she'd likely never return. Quantrill's raid on Lawrence happened on August 21st, 1863, a year later than Peterson's warning had suggested, proof that intelligence in wartime is never perfect and that delays happen for reasons nobody understands. But the target list proved accurate. Quantrill's men killed at least 150 men and boys in Lawrence, burned a quarter of the town, and specifically targeted households known for abolitionist sympathies. Martha's farm, abandoned for over a year by that point, was burned to the foundation. The quilts she'd left hanging were torn down and trampled into dirt. The root cellar, where she'd hidden refugees, was ransacked and filled with debris. If she'd been home when Quantrill's raiders came through, she wouldn't have survived. Being on the target list meant execution, not capture. The Lawrence Massacre marked a turning point in the border war, not because it was uniquely horrible. The region had seen plenty of comparable atrocities, but because its scale shocked people who'd thought they understood what violence in Kansas meant. The raid killed more people in a single morning than most previous attacks combined. It demonstrated that Confederate irregular forces were capable of coordinated, large-scale operations, not just scattered raids. And it provoked Union retaliation that would reshape the entire border region. Union General Thomas Ewing responded to the Lawrence Massacre with General Order No. 11, one of the most severe measures taken by Union forces during the war. The order forcibly depopulated 4 Missouri counties along the Kansas border: Jackson, Cass, Bates, and northern Vernon County. Every resident who couldn't prove unwavering loyalty to the Union was given 15 days to leave. Most couldn't prove loyalty because the standards were deliberately impossible to meet. Nearly all the civilian population was expelled, roughly 10,000 people forced from their homes regardless of their actual politics or involvement in Confederate activities. The evacuated area became a devastated no-man's land. Buildings were burned to prevent them being used by Confederate forces. Crops were destroyed. Livestock was killed or confiscated. The Missouri border region, which had been violently contested but populated, became a wasteland. The Quilt Code networks largely ceased operation after Lawrence and Order Number 11, not because they were discovered, but because the refugee populations they served had either fled the region entirely or been killed. The tactical situation had shifted from covert resistance to overt military occupation. There were no more safe houses because there were no more houses. No more signals because there was no one left to signal to. After the Civil War ended in 1865, Martha never returned to Kansas. She lived with her sister Mary in Iowa until 1868, helping with farm work, raising Sarah, trying to build some kind of normal life in the aftermath of trauma. She rarely spoke about her time running a station on the network. The few occasions when she did discuss it, usually late in life when she felt secure enough to acknowledge her wartime activities, her descriptions were matter-of-fact, almost clinical. She didn't romanticize the work or claim heroism. She described it as something that needed doing, that she'd done because she couldn't not do. That had cost everything but had been worth the cost because people lived who would have died. She remarried in 1868 to a merchant named Richard Sullivan, moved to Illinois, and lived quietly until her death in 1891. She raised Sarah, who grew up to marry a farmer, have children of her own, and live into the 1920s. Martha rarely discussed her wartime experiences with Sarah, perhaps protecting her from memories that Sarah was too young to have formed clearly, perhaps unable to reconcile the mother Sarah knew with the person Martha had been during the war. The letters to Mary, discovered in a trunk in 1943, provided some of the first documentary evidence that women in the Kansas border region had operated organized resistance networks using quilts as signals, though by that point most participants were dead and verification was difficult. The quilts themselves have mostly been lost to time, used until they wore out, then turned into rags or burned for warmth. A few documented examples survive in museum collections, quilts with provenance linking them to known Underground Railroad stations or border war safe houses. The Smithsonian holds 3 quilts explicitly documented as having been used for signaling. Various state historical societies have others, though provenance is often uncertain and documentation is thin. Most quilts that were used for resistance were ordinary items, not specially made, not marked in any way that would identify them as having been part of covert networks. They looked like what they were, bedding made by competent quilters using common patterns. The meaning existed not in the objects themselves, but in context, how they were displayed, when, in what combinations. The patterns themselves have been preserved in quilting traditions passed down through generations. A log cabin quilt pattern created today looks identical to log cabin quilts from the 1860s. The design is classical, unchanging, part of a folk tradition that has remained remarkably consistent across 150 years. Someone making a log cabin quilt now might not know that in 1861, that same pattern meant safe to approach, supplies ready, when hung on clotheslines in Kansas territory. The patterns continue as aesthetic traditions, their historical uses largely forgotten except by historians and quilting enthusiasts who study the intersection of craft and resistance. Modern historians studying the quilt code phenomenon face challenges that make definitive conclusions difficult. The primary sources are scattered across archives, fragmentary letters in family collections, brief mentions in military reports, post-war testimony collected decades after events when memory had been shaped by time and subsequent experiences. Oral histories passed down through families can be valuable, but require verification against documentary evidence when possible, and such verification is often impossible because the relevant documents were deliberately destroyed.
Some scholars argue that this evidential ambiguity has led to overclaiming in popular culture, that the quilt code narrative has been embraced so enthusiastically that it's become accepted as universal truth despite limited documentation. They point out valid methodological concerns. Most escaped slaves and many refugees would have been illiterate, making complex visual codes potentially difficult to teach and disseminate. Networks relying on unchanging symbols in wartime conditions would be vulnerable to rapid compromise once hostile forces learned the system. The absence of contemporary documentation, they argue, suggests the system was either limited in scope or has been significantly mythologized. These are serious concerns that deserve serious engagement rather than dismissal. Historical methodology requires skepticism, demands evidence, insists on distinguishing between what we can document and what we infer. But these methodological requirements must be balanced against understanding of how covert networks operate and how women's activities were recorded in 19th century sources. The absence of abundant contemporary documentation might indicate that the system was limited, or it might indicate that the system was working exactly as designed, leaving no evidence, maintaining secrecy, protecting participants through lack of documentation. The debate matters because it's fundamentally about recognizing women's participation in resistance movements and understanding that war involves far more than the military campaigns that dominate traditional histories. Dismissing the quilt code as myth because documentation is imperfect means erasing women's agency, suggesting that women weren't capable of sophisticated resistance or that their contributions weren't significant enough to warrant serious historical attention. But overclaiming prevalence without rigorous documentation creates false history that serves ideological purposes, making the past what we want it to have been, rather than grappling with what it actually was. What's indisputable is that women along the Kansas-Missouri border during the Civil War engaged in dangerous resistance work, often using methods that exploited gendered assumptions about domestic activities. Whether those methods primarily involved quilts or relied on other signals is less important than recognizing the courage and strategic thinking required. These women operated without military protection, legal authority, or reliable backup. Discovery meant death, often preceded by torture designed to extract names of other network members. They did it anyway because they'd made moral calculations that survival without resistance wasn't survival worth having. The legacy of the quilt code networks extends into modern resistance movements, though connections aren't always direct or acknowledged. The principle of hiding communication in plain sight, exploiting oppressor assumptions and blind spots, using everyday objects as covert signals, building networks that can operate despite pervasive surveillance,
appears in resistance movements globally. Polish civilians during World War II used chalk marks on walls to guide underground fighters. French resistance members hung laundry in specific patterns to signal Allied forces and warn of German patrols. Modern activists use graffiti, clothing choices, hand signals, and digital imagery to communicate within movements while appearing innocuous to surveillance systems. The specifics change across time and technology, but the strategy remains. Make yourself invisible by appearing ordinary. Communicate through symbols that look innocent to hostile observation. Build networks resilient enough to survive even when individual members are compromised. The quilt code networks of 1860s Kansas weren't inventing these principles. Similar strategies appear throughout human resistance to oppression. But they demonstrated how effectively those principles could function in specific historical circumstances. And their example remains relevant for understanding how resistance actually works, rather than how it's romanticized in popular culture. For Martha Henderson specifically, the cost of her resistance was everything she'd built physically: her farm, her community connections, her sense of geographic stability and belonging. But in letters written late in her life, she expressed no regret about the work itself, only sorrow for those she couldn't help and anger about the system that made such desperate measures necessary. She wrote in 1873 to Sarah, who was then preparing to marry, "I want you to understand what those years meant, what I did and why. I broke laws that men had written. I lied constantly to protect people whose names I often didn't know. I put you in danger before you were old enough to consent to that risk. By conventional morality, by the standards respectable society applies to women's behavior, I failed as a mother and as a citizen. But I watched people die, Sarah. I watched them die from violence, from exposure, from despair. And I had the means to help some of them survive. How could I have chosen otherwise? What kind of person closes the door on someone bleeding on their porch, freezes to death yards from shelter, dies because no one would risk safety to offer help? I don't need history to forgive me because I forgave myself years ago. I did what was necessary, and I'd do it again." The three families hiding in Martha's root cellar that July afternoon in 1861, when the riders approached and she forced herself not to run, they made it out safely. The riders, as it turned out, were hunting for a specific escaped slave who'd killed his overseer in Missouri before fleeing. They had descriptions, names, specific intelligence. They asked Martha if she'd seen a man matching those descriptions. She said no, which was true. The people she was hiding didn't match what the riders described. They asked if anyone unusual had been around recently. She said travelers passed through sometimes, but she didn't pay much attention, kept to herself mostly. They seemed satisfied, or at least uninterested enough to not press further. They left after perhaps 15 minutes of questions that felt like hours. After they left, Martha waited until full dark before bringing the families up from the root cellar. They were cramped, terrified, certain they'd heard everything and that capture was imminent. She fed them, calmed them as best she could, and waited until near midnight before sending them north with detailed directions to the Patterson farm 4 miles away. They reached Iowa 2 weeks later, according to a message that came back through the network months afterward. They found work in Des Moines. The families separated as employment opportunities required. But they survived. they lived. One of the children from that group, a boy named Jacob, who was 7 when he hid in Martha's root cellar, listening to riders question his host about fugitives, later served in the Union Army during the final year of the war. He survived combat, survived disease that killed more soldiers than bullets, and lived until 1924. He occasionally told the story of the woman who sheltered his family, who risked everything to give them a chance, who he never saw again after that single night, but who he thought about every time he faced a choice between safety and doing what was right. He told his children about her. They told their children. The story persisted through generations as a family narrative about survival and courage, about a white woman whose name they never knew, who chose solidarity over safety in a place where that choice could mean death. That's the real measure of the Quilt Code Network's impact. Not just the numbers of refugees moved, though those numbers mattered enormously to the individuals whose lives were saved. The deeper impact was the multiplication of courage, the way one person's choice to resist rippled outward into other lives and other choices. Martha sheltered Jacob's family, and Jacob survived to raise children who knew their father only lived because a stranger had been brave. Those children raised children of their own, passing down the story, the idea that ordinary people can choose to stand against violence, that resistance doesn't require armies or authority, just moral clarity and willingness to risk. The quilts that hung on Martha Henderson's clothesline in 1861 were cotton and wool, simple patterns stitched by candlelight during long winter evenings, bleached by sun and washed by rain until the colors faded from their original brightness. They served their purposes, kept people warm, created beauty in harsh circumstances, and occasionally communicated information that saved lives. They rotted eventually, or were thrown away or burned for warmth, or turned into rags decades after their original creation. No museum holds them. No historical marker commemorates the specific clothesline where they hung. The farm itself is gone, plowed under and subdivided decades ago, now residential streets in a town that didn't exist when Martha lived there. But the principle those quilts represented, that resistance can look like domestic work, that survival networks can hide in plain sight, that women's strategic intelligence could operate invisible to their enemies while saving lives, that principle proved as durable as any physical monument. The historical record will never be complete. Too much was deliberately hidden, too many records destroyed, too many participants died without sharing their stories or shared them in ways that weren't preserved. We'll never know exactly how many women operated stations, how many refugees found shelter through quilt signals, how many lives were saved by women who appeared to be doing nothing more significant than airing bedding. But we know enough to understand that the Kansas border war, like most wars, was fought on battlefields historians rarely name, at kitchen tables where decisions were made about who to help, in root cellars where refugees hid while hostile forces searched above, through symbols hung on clotheslines that communicated across miles, by people whose names don't appear in military records, but whose courage was no less real for being covert. The woman hanging quilts on her line, watching riders approach, forcing her hands not to shake while refugees hid beneath her floorboards, She was as much a soldier in that war as any man with a rifle. She just fought with different weapons, on a battlefield that looked like a farm, using tactics that appeared innocent even as they undermined the systems of violence she opposed. History is only beginning to recognize how many wars were fought this way, how many resistance movements operated through such networks, how many people survived because someone, usually a woman, chose risk over
Safety and courage over complicity.
The quilts themselves weren't magic. They were fabric and thread, patterns that took skill to create but weren't supernatural or even particularly unusual. What made them powerful was context, the network that gave them meaning, the refugees who knew how to read them, the women who hung them despite knowing the cost of discovery. In that context, a simple log cabin pattern became a lifeline, a promise kept, a door left open in a landscape where most doors were locked and barred against anyone who looked wrong or believed wrong or simply needed help at the wrong time. When Martha left Kansas in August 1862, she took almost nothing with her. The quilts stayed behind, hanging on the line or folded in the cabin, signals that would guide no one now that she was gone. But she'd done what she set out to do. She'd kept the door open as long as possible, helped everyone she could reach, and survived to see her daughter grow up in a world where choices like
That were still possible.
the war took her farm, her security, and 2 years of her life lived in constant fear. It didn't take her integrity. It didn't make her close the door. And for the 31 refugees whose names she recorded carefully and then destroyed to protect them, that refusal to close the door meant everything. If this story resonated with you, leave a like to help others discover these frontier resistance histories. Thanks for exploring the Western Pioneer archives with us.